Hey, hello everybody. It is Thursday, March 25th, and today I am going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is ADHD, trauma, and batch processing. So, I don't know if you know me or not, but I have had, as most people have had a lot of trauma in their life. A lot of mine was capital T trauma, like the big stuff, but it doesn't matter if you have capital T trauma or little t trauma. It affects you and your whole way of being if you don't handle it. And I've also not been officially clinically diagnosed as ADHD. However, I have all of the symptoms of ADHD, and in talking to my doctor, they basically confirmed that I did have it, although it wasn't like an official diagnosis. We just went through like a quick test to see, because I didn't want any medication. I didn't have to go through the diagnosis process to get the actual like clinical thing on my report, right? So what has been really interesting to me in my journey and learning more about my ADH, I very rarely say ADHD. A lot of times I say it when I'm talking to other people, but in general, I always say that I experience ADH because I feel like my ADH is a superpower and not a disorder, because one of the things that's really awesome about having it is that there is this ability to hyperfocus. Now, you may be wondering, well, I don't have ADH, and, what does this have to do with me? Chances are you probably have had trauma, because everyone has experienced trauma because we live in a pretty traumatic world, right? And it shows up in really interesting ways. Some not good. Some are actually kind of good because we do create these adaptive skills, right? To be able to help cope and deal with the trauma. So sometimes we actually create these really interesting habits that actually do benefit us. And in fact, anytime we experience trauma and we come up with an adaptive skill, it really did benefit us. It helped us get through the traumatic experience and helped us be able to process the information and continue on with life. However, a lot of times life has a tendency to keep going, and we're still stuck in the old traumatic behavior, and then it isn't necessarily conducive to the way that we want to be living our life. This shows up a lot with the business owners that I work with. And I definitely love working with people that are either new to business, or maybe they've been around it for a while, but they still just haven't been able to get that, step up and feel like they're always kind of struggling. And one of the things that I have seen consistently across the board with everybody is that there are behaviors that come up that are based in trauma. If you're wondering why I know a bunch about trauma, it is because my other job, career, whatever you want to call it, my other passion in life is I'm an orgasm coach. And so I help people through understanding the orgasm process and how to, adapt it so that way they can have more pleasure, right? And the whole thing about orgasms is that it's 100% involved with your nervous system. So any issues that come up at all with it, it always has to do with your nervous system. And if it's like a physical thing where it's blocked, and the nerve is being damaged, or it is more often than not a trauma-based response, which is preventing people from experiencing pleasure. So now bringing it back over to this business, what I do, as I said, is work with a bunch of, business owners that are building their business. And primarily I work with them to help them through the process of developing content for their website, because I have been a website developer for many, many years. However, the issue is never really about the tasks that have to be done. It is always about trauma responses that have been developed over the years, and that is preventing them from taking the action steps to move forward. And so the interesting thing about ADHD and trauma is that the more and more research that is being done about it is most people, or not even most, a lot of people that have ADHD may actually not have it from birth, say, but it may actually be a cause of childhood trauma. And so the thing is that where ADH affects the areas of the brain, when you experience childhood trauma, it affects the same areas of the brain. So depending, which came first, the trauma or the ADH, who knows, right? So it may be that all ADH is a trauma response, and we're still figuring that out, right? But it's starting to look like that actually is where ADH actually comes from. Of course, there's always the possibility that someone could be born with, I don't want to say misconfiguration, just a different configuration of the way the brain works. Like I have a son who had a very traumatic birth, and so his brain works a little bit differently than other normal, typical developing kids' brains, like my older son. But anyways, so back over to business. So there are certain behaviors that happen because of trauma. And one of the big things, especially if you had different kinds of trauma when you're a child, is the way that you create your identity and yourself based on what's happening with the trauma that you're experiencing. Now, as I said before, it doesn't have to be a big capital T trauma. It could be a little t trauma. Like maybe your mom was having just a really bad day, whatever it is. Like maybe they got bad news and they just didn't know how to process it because probably their parents didn't know, your grandparents didn't know how to process it. And then your mom didn't know how to deal with it very well. So they just expressed it in the way that they learned best from their life, right? But what happens is when you are a little child and you are experiencing trauma, it is very, very, very scary to think that the world is wrong and isn't behaving properly. Like your mom or your caregiver, like whoever it is, like it doesn't have to be mom, dad, aunt, uncle, grandparent, foster parent, whoever it is, right? If your caregiver is, creating an environment that, even if it's just very temporarily, doesn't feel safe, the thought for a child who whole world is basically them and the caregivers, for them to think that the whole basis of their security is unsafe doesn't work. And so what happens is, as humans, instead of focusing on the outside and seeing like, oh, my mom's having a bad day and doesn't know how to, deal with it, a little, say 18-month-old brain doesn't know how to come up with that process. So what actually starts happening is they start actually thinking that something is wrong with them. And so this is what happens over and over and over again. And then if people don't handle, everyone can have bad days. I just want to make, if you are a parent out there and you're watching, just because you have a bad day doesn't mean you're traumatizing your kid. There are ways to actually, change it and negate it and help your child to understand, that mommies have bad days too, and this is how we handle it, and then help them through the process of dealing with whatever emotions are coming up. So it's not about like fault or anything like that. It's about the skills that, everyone has at the point in time in which they're experiencing their experiences, right? So with the trauma that you experience as a child, this whole self-doubt and thinking that you're doing something wrong starts building up and building up. And then our brains are designed in a way to basically see the world and then try to find the stuff that matches our thoughts, because it's called like the reticular activating system. It's the same system like when you get a new car and say you get a Volkswagen Jetta, and now you're seeing Volkswagen Jettas all over the road, whereas before you decided to get a Volkswagen Jetta, you never saw a Volkswagen Jetta. That's called the reticular activating system. So it is a really important part of our learning process. It helps us filter out a lot of the nonsense in the world, so that way we can focus on the things that are important to our survival. And part of that, though, is when you start having this belief as a little, tiny child. And remember, it's not about fault or anything like that. It's just the way life works, unfortunately. If we start thinking that we don't have, that we've done something wrong to cause the unstable environment, we start seeing evidence that we are bad, that we are not worthy, that we are not, worthy of love. We are not worthy of good things. For example, I used to lose a lot of things when I was a kid, and my mom, one time offhandedly was like, oh my God, this is why I don't like buying you expensive things. As an adult, I totally understand what she's talking about. I have kids, and my son used to lose his water bottles all the time. I stopped buying him expensive water bottles. Like, we basically would buy regular water bottles, and I would just refill them up so that way when he would leave them, it didn't matter, and I didn't feel like we were wasting so much money, right? So, I get it. I totally get what my mom was coming from. But this is me as an adult hearing that information. As a child, I took it as, I don't deserve good things, right? I don't deserve expensive things. I don't deserve for you to spend money on me, right? And the reason I'm sharing this is because there's probably something that you've experienced in your life like that too. It doesn't necessarily have to be about good things. It could be about anything. Like maybe your parent was helping you with a report and if you look back on it, you can understand where their words were coming from. They were trying to come from like helping or just their own frustration, but they weren't necessarily knowing how to handle it in the best way at that time. But as a child, we don't have that, the years of life experience and knowledge to be able to create a rational thought such as, oh, my mom, just didn't want to spend any more money because, she just wanted to wait a little bit until I got, maybe developed a habit of not losing things, right? So you can see how it, that is a logical explanation now, and I can see it, and I understand my mom completely loved me, but at the time, that whole belief stayed with me, right? And then as a business owner, when I was starting out, about 15, 20 years ago on my own, I had a really, really hard time asking for my worth. And this is where trauma shows its head, right? So I, as a business owner, even though I was completely, capable and I should be, this is like as a web developer, the skills that I had even 15 years ago, I should have easily been making $75 to $100 an hour, but I was charging like $15 an hour, $20 an hour, and I'm really happy if I made $35 an hour. And that was basically just a trauma response. I kind of got off tangent on where I wanted to go with this, but I still wanted to show how trauma does rear its head out when it comes to business. So just because we may be working on trauma in other areas of our life, the trauma does come up in all areas of our life. We don't live in a little silo. So anytime you work, but the good thing about it is anytime you work on any part of trauma in your life in any area, it's going to start helping you in other areas too. I've experienced this as an intimacy coach. When I start helping people learning how to receive pleasure, they start learning how to receive other things in life, like receive compliments, receive money, receive, all kinds of good things, not just the intimate pleasure, right? So working through your trauma is going to help. And especially if you have ADHD, it's really important that you do work through your trauma, especially as a business owner, because there are some little big things that come up with people who have ADHD that are not necessarily conducive to operating a business. One of them in particular, if you're aware of it or not aware of it, whether you have ADHD or not, is focus, right? I think people struggle with this all the time. They always want to have focus, want to be able to stay on task and do the things that they created a plan for. And this is where batch processing really, really comes into play, especially if you have ADHD or if you experienced a life with quite a lot of trauma and you know that you are working through that trauma. And especially if you're actively working on healing that trauma, because when you work on healing your trauma, you will have your ingrained trauma responses coming up more frequently. So creating a system that is going to help support you while you work through your trauma is going to be really important. And this is where batch processing comes into play. So our brains have there's different areas of the brains and different regions of the brains, and they do different things, and they're very good at different tasks, right? So for example, the task of doing repetitive work is in a different area of the brain than, say, strategizing. And the one thing that is important to note too is also like, the creative side of brain. Like you hear people talking about the difference between left brain and right brain, right? So the left brain is logical and the right brain is artsy, right? By the way, I always remember that because L, logical, left, logical, R, right, artsy, right? Just in case you ever want, if you forget which side is which. So the left logical brain is going to be able, when you're engaging that area, you're going to be able to stay on task easier and be able to, kind of basically, do one thing after another once you engage the left side of the brain. When you go into the more our right side of the brain, artsy, that's when you're going to be able to be more creative, and strategizing is all going to be in that kind of realm. Now, as someone with ADHD or trauma, you're going to probably, venture towards one side or the other. A lot of times, people assume that everyone is really creative if they have like ADHD, but sometimes people actually really like that logical side of it because it feels very safe for them. So it just depends on you and your personality. You will know where your strengths and weaknesses are and which side you like to kind of venture towards to. Now, batch processing comes into play, especially with the ADHD and trauma, because what happens is if you are doing an activity that is causing you, if you're focusing on one thing and one thing only, and you can start getting really deep into it in what's called the flow state. And people who have ADHD and trauma actually can get into the flow state easier. This is why I think ADHD is a superpower than people who don't experience ADHD or have severe trauma, or not even just severe, but just have experienced a lot of trauma that they're working through. And that is because we have an ability to escape and start to get focused kind of in our own world. Now, most of the time that does have a tendency to happen over in that R, that strategy, that artsy part. And so, but it can also happen over into the logical side as well. It will be, if you find that you are really drawn to the artsy part, then the batch processing is going to really help you when it comes to those logical things. Because the second you try to switch and go back and forth from one task to another task, you're going to be engaging different areas of your brain. And as I said, your brain is going to want to maybe stay focused more on one side or the other side. And so by not allowing yourself to be able to switch back over, to the side that you prefer and staying focused over on activities that are the same kinds of activities. So for example, like when I'm doing websites, I try not to do strategy and designing and programming at the same time, because it's really hard for my brain to get out of the strategizing, because that is definitely where my brain likes to stay focused. Now, some people really like the design stuff. That is actually probably my weakest part. And so if I have, things come up that is getting me over into programming and getting me over to strategizing, I'm going to completely leave the design part of what needs to get done. So when it comes to designing, I will go and do, say, for example, like my social media post, I will just go and create like 15 pictures in a row. I will have done the strategizing before. Well, I say I'm going to be doing quotes, right? So I will go and do all of my searching for my quotes and then write up the captions and just do all of that processing at the same time, because it's using the same kind of areas of the brain. And then once I have a bunch of those quotes together with the captions, then I will go do a bunch of batch processing to create the images from them. Because now I don't have to get into that creative strategizing aspect. I can stay focused on the design part of it. And then when it comes to scheduling, then I go and do a whole batch of scheduling, which is more of like that logical aspect of it. So by batch processing this, you're going to actually help you with your especially if you have a tendency to get unfocused and maybe lose motivation and kind of go do the whole squirrel where and go off on a different tangent. Now, there's some tools that are really, I find very useful to be able to do the batch processing. One of them is called Pomodoro Pomodoro. There's different timers that you can find online. The basic premise of Pomodoro is that you set a timer for 25 minutes and then you take a break for 5 minutes and then you set your Pomodoro timer again and then you do another short break and then you'll have a long break in between. Now, 25 minutes does not normally work very well for me, and this has to do with my ADHD or my trauma response, and that is because it does take me a bit of time to start getting into that focused flow state. As an ADHD person that experiences ADHD, if my mind starts to wander off, it takes me a little bit of time to get back in that practice of pulling it back. When I set a timer and I know that I have 45 minutes, it is a little bit easier to stay focused because I know I've got this timer going and it's like, okay, I can, if I have a thought, so like say I have an idea, like one of those creative things, the strategizing things that I love to do so much, I always keep a notebook next to me and I just write it down real quick and then I go back to what it is that I'm doing and then I write it down real quick and then go back to what I was doing. And then I find that eventually that time in between writing it down and going back starts to lengthen, right? So I'm spending more time on the task that I'm actually doing and less time having my mind wander. And it usually takes me about 15-20 minutes to get into that focus state. So if I was only doing a 25-minute Pomodoro, I would basically only have 5 to 10 minutes of actually focused work. That's why I find the 45-minute works really well. I don't do short breaks. I just do a 15-minute break. I usually spend the first 5 minutes writing down all of the things that I had wrote down and putting it into my task manager, which if you work with me, you know that is Asana. I have a whole brain dump project where everything that I just have a random thought about, I put into the brain dump. So that way I don't actually have to focus on it and I can go back to the task at hand. And then once I put everything into my Asana from my list, then I go have my break. And then when the timer comes off, I go back and then I work again. Now, I wanted to share that because I think that it is a very simple process that actually works really effectively. You may want to play around with the different times. If you don't have ADHD or you're not actively working on trauma or you don't have a trauma response, then maybe the 25 minutes will work good for you. If you do find that 25 minutes just isn't enough time to get out there and get focused, then play around and use the 45-minute timer with the long 15-minute timers in between. I really do find them effective. I've had a couple of the people that I work with try it and they work really well for them as well, because I do have a tendency to attract people that have ADHD or trauma. I think it's, the birds of a feather flock together, right? So people do find me when they do have that superpower of ADHD, right? So that is what I want to talk about with the batch processing and ADHD and the trauma. Let me go check real quick and see if there is any questions or comments that are going on right now, because I forgot.
All right, so people do find me when they do.
All right. I just saw that. Don't you feel that structure limits your creative flow? No. So actually, I find it kind of like it's kind of like a comforting cocoon, if that makes sense. So it's just this opportunity to lose myself in the work that I'm doing with that batch processing, because the biggest distraction really is having those different thoughts that come up frequently, and I allow myself a lot of time to be able to do that creative, that strategizing, that fun, free flow. But then by creating these also opportunities to do the work that I don't necessarily want to do and have a tendency to put off, or maybe I have some resistance to, then that creating this time, it's like 45 minutes, like, okay, I can devote 45 minutes to whatever this is that I have this resistance for. And usually that's why the 45 minutes works well, is because I find that resistance starts to melt away after about 10, 15, 20 minutes, like after writing down all my little things. That is when I actually get into the flow state, and then I can create all of those things that I've been resisting, and you feel so good afterwards because you set a timer. And even if you you mess up. So like when I first started doing, I hate saying mess up. It was just practice, right? So every time I would set a timer, sometimes I would find I would have completely forgot about what I was doing, went on some rabbit trail, did some research, and that is when I started keeping the notebook next to me. I find that notebook is super, super crucial to be able to stay focused on the task that I'm supposed to do, because as soon as I have a thought, I can write it down in my notebook, know that I'm still going to be able to go have fun with that thought and come up with new, fun, creative things about it later, but in the right time and place for it. So that is where I do find that it's really useful when it comes to doing that batch processing. Let me do a copy of this link right now for the Pomodoro timer that I use, so that way you guys can check it out. It's a tomato timer, right? They also have timers for your phone too, so like there's different apps to be able to do it. Some are paid, some are not, but this is one that's just online, and I find it's really useful and easy. And so yeah, that was interesting about that's cool that you kind of did a whole speech on this exact thing and about your experience as well. So if there aren't any more questions, then I think that is kind of, I'm not going to just keep talking just to keep talking. So I hope this was helpful and that you were able to get something out of it. And check out the Pomodoro timer, play around with it, see what actually works for you. Maybe it's the 25 minutes, maybe it's the 45 minutes. As I said, I do find that the 45 minutes allows that time at the beginning to kind of get past the resistance of doing the activity that you are supposed to be doing, right? Or you want to be doing. Not even supposed to, right? You want to be doing it. At the end of the day, it's something that you want to do that you know is going to help your business. And the timer is just a way to help you, get to that goal. All right. So I hope you guys found that useful, and I will see you guys next week. All right. Bye, everybody.